In this episode, we're going to take the idea of targeted risk analysis and turn it into something you can picture, explain, and defend without feeling like you are waving your hands. When beginners hear the phrase risk analysis, they often imagine a giant spreadsheet, complicated math, or a formal corporate exercise that somehow lives far away from day-to-day security reality. In QSA work, targeted risk analysis is much more focused because it exists to support a specific control decision in a specific context, and it has to be strong enough that another professional could review it and agree the logic holds. That is what it means to stand up, because the goal is not to produce a document that sounds serious, but to produce reasoning that is clear, evidence-grounded, and appropriately cautious. If you treat targeted risk analysis like a loophole or a narrative you can write after the fact, it will collapse under scrutiny. If you treat it like a disciplined way to justify a choice, it becomes one of your most powerful tools. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is understanding why targeted risk analysis exists at all, because it is easy to treat it like extra paperwork instead of a core assessment skill. Payment environments vary widely, and the same requirement intent can be met through different operational rhythms, different architectures, and different control designs. The standard needs a way to allow organizations to make reasoned choices, like how often a process must happen, without forcing every environment into one rigid schedule that might not fit reality. Targeted risk analysis is the mechanism that supports those choices because it ties a decision to the actual risk landscape of the environment being assessed. A qualified security assessor, QSA, is expected to evaluate whether that reasoning is legitimate, not merely whether it exists. This is why the exam and the profession emphasize defensibility, because defensibility is the difference between flexibility and weakness. When targeted risk analysis is done well, it makes security stronger by aligning effort to real risk rather than to habit. Now, let's define what targeted risk analysis actually is in plain language so you can keep your mental model clean. A targeted risk analysis, TRA, is a focused evaluation of risk that is performed to justify a specific control choice for a specific requirement, rather than a broad enterprise risk program that tries to rank every possible threat. The targeted part matters because it narrows the scope of analysis to the system, process, and decision that the requirement is concerned with. The analysis should name what you are protecting, what could realistically go wrong, and what would happen if it did, and then connect that to why the chosen control frequency or method is appropriate. It is not enough to say the organization is low risk or high risk, because that is a label, not reasoning. The analysis must show the path from conditions to threats to impact to control choice. When you can tell that story coherently, you are already most of the way toward an analysis that stands up. A targeted risk analysis stands up when it is specific to the environment, and specificity is where many beginners accidentally become vague. If the analysis uses generic language that could apply to any company, it is a warning sign because it suggests it was copied or written to satisfy a form. A standing analysis describes the environment in meaningful terms, such as the nature of payment channels, the segmentation posture, the exposure to external networks, the complexity of system administration, and the role of third parties. It also reflects the organization's operational reality, like how frequently changes occur, how stable configurations are, and how quickly the team can respond to alerts. This does not mean the analysis has to be long, but it does mean it has to be grounded. A QSA reading It should be able to connect statements to evidence gathered during the assessment, because that is what makes it credible. When the analysis describes conditions the assessment cannot verify, it becomes fragile. The next piece is understanding the kinds of decisions targeted risk analysis is usually used to support, because that will help you recognize what good looks like. Often, it is tied to frequency decisions, such as how often a control must be performed, reviewed, tested, or validated. It can also be tied to choices in the customized approach, where an organization is meeting a requirement objective through a different method and needs to show that risk is managed equivalently. In both cases, the analysis is not just describing risk in the abstract. It is justifying a practical control posture. A weak analysis will jump from a broad statement, like, "We have strong security," to a conclusion, like, "Therefore annual review is fine," without showing why. A stronger analysis will explain what threats are plausible, what changes could introduce new risk, and how detection and response capabilities reduce the window of exposure. This is where you can see that targeted risk analysis is really about reasoning discipline. To perform targeted risk analysis well, you need a stable structure in your head, not as a checklist you recite, but as a set of questions that keep you honest. You want to be clear about the asset or process being protected, because risk is meaningless unless you know what loss would look like. You want to identify realistic threat events, which means not every imaginable disaster, but the things that could plausibly happen given the environment, the attack surface, and the history of incidents in similar environments. You want to consider vulnerabilities and conditions that make those threats more likely, like weak segmentation, broad administrative access, or frequent changes. You want to think about impact in concrete terms, including data exposure, fraud risk, operational disruption, and reputational harm. Finally, you want to connect that combined picture to why the selected control method or frequency reduces risk to an acceptable level. When each step flows into the next, the analysis stands up because it is coherent. One of the most common beginner misunderstandings is thinking that targeted risk analysis is primarily a way to justify doing less work, like performing a control less often. Sometimes it can support a longer interval, but it can just as easily support doing something more often when risk is higher or when the environment changes frequently. A good analysis is not motivated by convenience. It is motivated by risk reality. If you see an analysis that always concludes the minimum effort is appropriate, regardless of environment complexity, you should be skeptical. Another misunderstanding is treating controls as if they exist in isolation, when in reality control strength depends on how controls support each other. For example, a longer review interval might be more defensible if monitoring and alerting are strong and response is fast, because the environment can detect and correct issues before long exposure occurs. Conversely, if monitoring is weak and changes are frequent, a longer interval becomes harder to defend. Targeted risk analysis stands up when it acknowledges these relationships, rather than pretending one control solves everything. Evidence is what turns a risk analysis from a story into a defensible argument, and this is where QSA thinking becomes especially important. The analysis should be supported by things you can verify, like documented architecture, change volume patterns, incident handling capability, access control models, and operational procedures that are actually followed. If the analysis claims changes are rare, there should be evidence that change activity is controlled and infrequent, not just a statement of intent. If the analysis claims the organization detects issues quickly, there should be evidence of monitoring coverage, response playbooks, and examples of response outcomes, not just a promise. The goal is not to demand perfection, but to ensure the conclusions are anchored in reality. A bulletproof analysis can be reviewed later and still make sense because it is tied to observable facts. When evidence is missing, you either gather it or the analysis must reflect uncertainty honestly, because pretending certainty is what makes an analysis collapse. Another key element is making sure the analysis fits the scope and boundaries of the cardholder data environment, CDE, because risk cannot be evaluated correctly if you are unclear about what is in play. If segmentation is strong and boundaries are well enforced, the risk landscape may be narrower, which can support certain control choices. If boundaries are porous, or if connected systems can impact CDE security, the risk landscape expands, which often demands a stronger control posture. This means targeted risk analysis is not a standalone activity you do in a vacuum. It is an extension of scoping work and data flow understanding. A QSA should be able to trace how the environment design influences threat plausibility, because that is how you avoid generic conclusions. If the analysis ignores known connectivity, shared services, or administrative pathways, it is incomplete. When the analysis reflects the true shape of the environment, it becomes much harder to challenge because it shows you considered real pathways of compromise. It is also important to recognize that targeted risk analysis should capture assumptions clearly, because hidden assumptions are one of the fastest ways for an analysis to fail. An assumption might be that a third-party service is responsible for a certain security function, or that a control is centrally managed and consistently applied. If those assumptions are true and supported, they strengthen the analysis by explaining why risk is reduced. If they are not verified, they become weak points that a reviewer can attack, because the conclusion depends on something that might not be real. A strong analysis either verifies assumptions or frames them as conditions that must remain true for the conclusion to remain valid. This is also where ongoing review makes sense, because risk posture can change when assumptions change. For beginners, the mindset shift is that assumptions are not embarrassing, they are normal, but they must be visible. Making them visible is what makes the analysis stand up, because targeted risk analysis often influences control frequency. You should be comfortable with the idea that frequency is really about exposure windows. If a control checks for something that could drift, like configuration compliance, the question becomes how long you are comfortable allowing drift to exist before detection. In a stable environment with strong change control, drift might be rare, and longer intervals might still keep exposure small. In a fast-changing environment, drift can occur weekly or daily, and longer intervals might create a large exposure window where issues accumulate. This logic is more important than memorizing any specific time frame, because the exam and real work care about your reasoning, not your ability to recite a number. You also want to consider compensating detection, like monitoring and alerts, because detection can shrink exposure even if the formal review interval is longer. Targeted risk analysis stands up when it demonstrates you thought about exposure honestly and matched controls to that exposure. When you are evaluating someone else's targeted risk analysis as a QSA, you are essentially checking for coherence, completeness, and evidence support, rather than looking for fancy language. Coherence means the story flows logically from environment description to threats to impacts to control choice without leaps. Completeness means major plausible threats and major influencing conditions are not ignored just because they are inconvenient. Evidence support means claims are anchored in things you can verify during the assessment, not in optimism. You should also watch for warning signs like overly broad statements, missing references to scope, and conclusions that seem pre-decided. Another warning sign is when the analysis treats risk as purely theoretical and does not acknowledge operational reality, such as frequent changes, third-party dependencies, or staffing limits that affect response speed. A standing analysis does not need to be dramatic, but it should feel grounded and honest. If it reads like marketing, it will not survive scrutiny. For exam success, targeted risk analysis questions often test Whether you understand that the analysis must be specific, must be evidence-based, and must connect directly to the decision it is justifying. Answer choices that accept generic statements without validation are usually weak because they confuse documentation with defensibility. Choices that insist no analysis is ever acceptable, or that every environment must follow the same frequency regardless of risk, are also usually weak because they ignore why targeted risk analysis exists. The strongest answers typically emphasize defining the security objective, identifying realistic threats and impacts, grounding assumptions in verified evidence, and documenting why the chosen control method or cadence is appropriate. If you are unsure in a question, ask yourself whether the proposed approach would still make sense to an independent reviewer who is not emotionally invested in the outcome. If it would, it is probably closer to correct. If it relies on trust, convenience, or vague claims, it is probably not standing up. To conclude, performing targeted risk analyses that stand up is about disciplined reasoning that connects a specific environment and a specific decision to a clear, evidence-supported risk story. A targeted risk analysis, TRA, is focused by design, but it still must be rigorous, because it often justifies how a requirement objective is achieved or how often a control must operate. The analysis becomes defensible when it is specific to the assessed environment, aligned to accurate scope and CDE boundaries, and supported by evidence rather than optimistic assertions. It stands up when assumptions are visible, when exposure windows are considered honestly, and when control choices are tied to realistic threats and impacts. For AQSA, the goal is not to produce impressive language, but to produce a chain of logic that another professional could follow and accept. When you learn to build and evaluate that chain, you gain a skill that strengthens both exam performance and real assessment credibility.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.